All right, sweet. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture on climate medicine with Dr. Stuart Harris. We're really excited to have everybody here. And before we begin, we'll just go over a couple of ground rules. I have Seth here and Katrina here, and they're going to help with monitoring just a little bit. And we would like if you all could turn on your cameras, that'd be great. If you don't want to, it's personal choice. And if you want to add next to your names any universities or organizations that you are affiliated with, that's always cool to look at. So we always like to start off with the mission statement, which is to create an educational platform where interested students and healthcare professionals can explore and interact with wilderness and emergency medicine. Of course, we also want to make this a international community and a diverse community. And if there's anything that we can do to uphold our mission better, we always love the feedback. And we hope you guys are enjoying our lecture series as well. Today, here we are, February 8th with climate medicine. Have a couple more talks coming up bi-weekly for if you're in school the rest of the semester up until April. And here are just a couple of the previous lectures that we had. You can find all of the archived lectures on our website on gome.org. And of course, if you would like to join the mailing list to stay the most up to date with lectures as well as wilderness medicine opportunities, such as we had a wilderness medicine certification class a couple weeks ago, as well as fellowship showcases, etc. Please scan the QR code, join our mailing list. And finally, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram if you'd like to stay even more up to date and have any additional tidbits of information and whatnot. And so today I'd like to introduce Dr. Stuart Harris. He's an emergency physician and the founder and director of the MGH Division of Wilderness Medicine. I apologize. His research pedigree is expansive and includes pathogenesis of high altitude pulmonary edema and health effects of the climate crisis. His work has taken him around the world, from the Mount Everest region, Denali National Park, the Iowa Writers Workshop, and the Woods Hole Research Institution, which is in Massachusetts. In 2005, he founded and annually teaches Medicine in the Wild, 28-day senior medical student course exploring the intersection of literature, health, ethics, and the biosphere. He is faculty at the Kennedy School Arctic Initiative, working with Dr. John Holdren and on health and policy. Dr. Harris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Beautiful. Can everybody hear me? Seth, can you hear me? Owen?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes.
Beautiful. All righty. I appreciate the kind introduction and want to fully credit, there's a excellent internal medicine resident here at MGH who just wrote that. So my hat's off to Jake. He's kinder than he ought to have been. This is completely laid back. I'm happy if anybody wants to raise a hand, I'll try to pay attention. And if I miss it, somebody else can feel free to call out. But really an introduction to different parts of climate medicine. So let me go ahead and share my screen if I can get my computer to. Sorry, I've got a brand new computer and it's, I think the fact that we're recording this, it's getting kind of nudgy. Give me 1 second. Egad. I might need to drop off for a second. It's telling me I need to quit Zoom in order to reconfigure it so it can be recorded. So I apologize, but I will be right back.
That is perfectly okay. We will be here. to those that are just joining. Dr. Harris is working out a short technical issue, so we'll get started shortly.
May I ask to have screen sharing re-enabled, please?
Yes. Here we go.
All right, we seeing things?
Yes.
Woo! Technology can only overcome so much endurance, doggedness. So again, I'm happy to be interrupted at any point. I see this as an opportunity for a community to be built. So I can ramble on, but I am happy to have this be a engaged conversation by multiple people. So normally I'm going to be talking about climate change. I really see this as tying together the last 35 years of my work and just where we are as a species. I see it less as a primer on kind of the sometimes, and it's important, but I think doctors can sometimes get down in the weeds in a way that we lose sight of the bigger picture and what our role can be. So this is my kind of effort towards that. I start off asking the question of why do we do what we do? And I started life well into my later 20s as kind of an arch rationalist that, you know, the world was something you could be figured out. We just thought about it hard enough and honestly enough. And the longer I'm in medicine and the longer I'm in policy and seeing things, yes, we have tremendous capacities in our cerebral cortex, but it's always worth remembering that evolutionarily, if you look at the human brain, you've got that lizard component from ancient days that keeps us breathing, that keeps us moving around, and that's in no way conscious. You know, some millions and millions of years later, we got the early mammalian brain where emotions tend to be located in the limbic system and the hippocampus. And that similarly is running really completely below the radar. And so it's, we're not even aware of how it's impacting the cortex. And then at that outermost layer, we have the rational brain, that which we think is in charge. And increasingly, I'm dubious of that prospect, that so much of what we do as individuals, as a species, I think the decision making is done in the lizard and the mammalian brain, and then the human cortex kind of jumps on at the last minute to try to justify it. And so as we look at policy and just how we address things in ways that ultimately make sense, if you look at a lizard and mammalian brain running the show, but if you're just looking at things rationally, humans aren't rational creatures. We don't do what we do. You know, we don't get married, marry who we do. We don't have children. We don't do all the things that are most impactful in our life for a rational reason. So I think it's just worth having a little humility in that. The second, just in over the course really of the pandemic, Simone Weil's attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity increasingly strikes me as true, that I think sometimes we get overwrought with trying to affect major change on some global scale, where really, as I see it, the way we affect change as individuals and in our individual relationships and in our profession is by knowing where to pay attention and actually paying attention when we think we are. So a quick step back, what is wilderness medicine? About 15 years ago, there are a bunch of different competing definitions. I came up with the provision of resource limited medicine under austere conditions. And at least for me and for what I do, what I care about and what I want to see the field become, this kind of catches the spectrum. So it's not necessarily distance from a definitive medical care, but if you got the resource limited medicine and austere conditions, it really speaks to where it is we operate. I'm sometimes asked, where was the first school of wilderness medicine? This is new, it's different. The first fellowship was less than 20 years ago. And my argument is that, no, it's not new at all, that it's a recapitulation of the ancient history of medicine, where 2,400 years ago, a doctor sat down outside, paid attention to a patient in front of them, listened to their story, and did a good physical exam and used their brain. And that ability to have a human connection is really what undergirds any good medicine. So whether it's in the ED or the ICU or in the office, that ability to not put a computer between you and your patient, to be typing in orders when you should be actually listening to them, to use that fantastic engine of diagnosis that is story. We don't even pay attention to it. I think we do it so obviously and easily. It's kind of like language. It just rises and it's like, oh, we don't, need to give any thought to where that comes from or what its powers are, where really that's what's fundamentally us. I think we can get caught in being a data-driven species, not realize that really the one superpower that humans and physicians in particular have is the ability to tell a story, to use narrative to make sense of the world. The span of wilderness medicine is the other aspect of it that I think is critically important and that medicine is missing right now. So wilderness medicine recognizes health as an ecological phenomena. It's not inclusive in the sense of, we're going to do something socially for this little period, as we should have been doing all along, but it's truly inclusive of all of humanity and of all of non-humanity, the living biosphere upon which all of our health depends, in any sense of social justice must have its origins. It's one that doesn't recognize and fights against the current silos of intellect and funding of scientific curiosity. So if you look at the federal government as the primary source of funding for a lot of the work that goes on, whether it's straight science or human science, if you've got a human health question, it's funded by the NIH. And if you've got an environmental health question, it's funded by the National Science Foundation. And it's like the two are completely unrelated. And obviously the source of human health being a functioning biosphere, we need to get to the point that we recognize that there is such a vast interconnection there that if we're not funding kind of cross-cultural research, that we're just going to be left alone in a bad place. I put up this slide. Jim Henson is in 1988, he sat down before the US Congress and laid out the scope of global warming. And the data at that point were pretty damn compelling. It wasn't like this was a mystery. And I think what's happened since then is fairly massively disappointing. And I think it's been not something that either party can claim responsibility for in the States, and how across the globe we've not responded, even though the data were overwhelming and clear. And that's why looking at why people do what they do, if we're not a data-driven species, what is motivating what we do? I think to give any kind of a talk on climate change and not to have people just stunningly familiar with the Keeling curve would be a failure. So it's oftentimes tossed out there. And I think one thing I'd love for everybody to come away from this talk on is just an absolute bedrock sense of, there are a lot of complex things in the world. This is not one of them. It's pretty damn straightforward. And it's something as a physician, as an educated citizen, you should be able to own. And I think too often people in the environmental community, which, I mean, that's just such a bizarre concept. It's like, we're all part of our environmental community if we want to exist as a species. But just a familiarity with the basic mechanism of why the Earth is warming. So the Keeling curve, Professor Keeling in the late 50s started measuring carbon dioxide levels off in Hawaiian Islands just because they were relatively untouched by local massive sources of carbon dioxide. And he started charting out this curve. So you can see down at the bottom left corner that we're down around 280 parts per million at the start of the industrial age. There it's around 300, and we're rapidly progressing where we're up well over 400 now. I think kind of the cool things about this, one are the sawtooth pattern, and you can see that in the inset up in the top left corner, that the Earth has a majority of its land mass in the northern hemisphere. And so in the summertime, when that land mass is turning green and the deciduous trees are gobbling up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turning it into sugars and leaves, that you get as we get into summer. So in the middle, I'm sorry, my cursor isn't working. But if you look at July, that's where we cross the boundary. And if you can think of late summer, that massive inflow of carbon dioxide into vegetative matter, and you get a readily measurable decrease in the whole globe's carbon dioxide level, which is like, that's freaking cool. And then you can see as you get into winter, into October in the northern hemisphere, it kind of drops off, and then not surprisingly, as it warms up and those leaves are turned into are gobbled by microbes and fungi, and the carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere, you get this release. And so it's almost as if the environment, the biosphere, is respirating. It's kind of in and out on a regular basis of this flux. But what's changing is, while there's a regular sinusoidal pattern of flow in and out of vegetative matter of atmospheric carbon dioxide, that the overarching flow is one of gradually increasing. And so we've gone from being fairly reasonable levels. If we look at the historic levels, so I've got friends who are financiers and Wall Street geniuses who will make more money than all of us combined in 5 minutes. They'll make in their 5 minutes. We'll work our whole lives and not make it. And I've been told by people who are really good at this, it's like, Stuart, you just have to be right 51% of the time in finance. That if you have big enough numbers, if you can find any small indication that you're going to beat the mean, you're going to end up a rich human being. And that's, if you look at this curve, so the blue is the carbon dioxide levels, the red is the temperature. And you can see, just if we want to talk about scientifically, the kappa, just there's a modeling. So one's following right after the other. And it's the carbon dioxide levels, as we've had releases from volcanoes and other things. There's been some variation in carbon dioxide levels, but where, if you look at the last 800,000 years, we're in a territory now where we are off the charts as far as both the rapidity of change and the ultimate magnitude of change. And so the changes that are going to be baked into what's going to happen in the years ahead are real and going to be massive. And the one chance we have is to try to get out in front of this and to mute the curve of carbon dioxide rise in order not to have the temperature follow against us. Do we have any questions at this point? I'm happy to stop. And anybody? So again, if we look back to 88, Seth, did you have something or?
I was just going to say all's quiet in the chat so far.
All righty, all's quiet on the Western Front. I'll take your word on that. So part of me is, if you're in medical practice, I think one good thing we do is we tend to look at outcomes and figure out, well, this is what they say should be happening. And if patients aren't doing it, or if the physiology isn't responding, I think we do a pretty good job of stepping back and saying, so what am I missing here? How are we misdescribing this circumstance? And what kind of a framework could we put on this that we could better understand it? So for me, looking back to 88, where it was obvious at that point to me that, no, this is real and this needs to be addressed. And my wandering course before medical school, I took like 6 years between undergrad and med school, and commercial fished in Alaska and did a bunch of different things. But I got my master's in fine arts and fiction. And so just that storytelling capacity of how do we frame what we do, I think explains a lot more about human nature and the failures of policy of the last 30 years than just a look at the data. So over this period of time, I've tried a bunch of different ways of trying to tell the story of how do you alter individuals' decision making. And I think it ultimately is storytelling. So we've tried a bunch of different ways to get individual citizens, to get patients, to get caregivers to recognize kind of how is it that you make the decisions you do, and to try to tell the story that will help advance that. Part of how we've done that is our Medicine in the Wild course. So for the last 15 years, we've had a senior medical student course, a 28-day course in the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico, where people are reading a wide range of books before they get there. They're talking about a climate change curriculum, also a wilderness medicine curriculum. And then as much as anything, they're, I think, existing outside for 28 days, where I think wilderness medicine and experiential education outside can make things that seem like they're complex pretty obvious. So if you don't have water, you can't camp there. If it's too damn cold and too windy, you're going to get blown off and your tent's going to go traveling down the canyon. And that's what we're insulated from a lot in the front country. So if you can just flip on the lights at any time, if it's too hot, you can turn on the AC. If it's too cold, you can turn on the heat with the flip of a switch. You can turn a tap and clean potable water comes out, or you can flush your sewage. That makes it easy to act like, oh, this is a human problem. And it's obviously, it's how we intersect with the environment that's going to determine how well our kids and grandkids and future generations do. Part of this, and this slide has its origin about a month ago. I was listening to an ego woke, as he described himself, podcast talking about trying to put numbers on the biosystems that undergird our economies. And so they were looking at, how do we attach a price tag to things that are going on in the environment that impact our economies. And so my question to you, and you can just write this down, you don't have to share it with anybody, but what percentage of this roughly $100 trillion global economy is based on a functioning biosphere? And just not to lead the audience, but some of the experts being quoted were saying, we think it's roughly 45 trillion of this 100 trillion are related to a functioning biosphere. To which my point, and this was somebody who I think is doing work to try to undergird the problem we're facing, is to quote, or to steal from President Clinton when he was trying to get reelected, had a very insightful political commentator say, it's the economy, stupid. That everything else that you think is important is like, no, it's really this. And my feeling is this, no, it's the ecology, stupid. So all health, all of the environment is completely and utterly dependent on a functioning biosphere. So I've somebody who believes that kind of like the brain we've inherited from, millions of years ago, a lot of things are going on there beneath our awareness. And similarly, the words we use have freight. And in this case, ecology and economy share the same Greek root for home, eco. That is, I think sometimes we're cowed into thinking that, there are Nobel Prizes for economy, for economics, but none for ecology. And I think that sense of, if we're going to address a climate problem, it's going to be so expensive. It's an economy problem where for the last 7,000 years as a species, we've been in a pretty good spot where we've been able to pretty much do what we want to and act like ecology doesn't matter. Where for the first time in human history, we're at a point where we're reaching or exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet. And so we need to be aware that the cost that will be borne, and we can see this maybe in the current pandemic, certainly in other systems, but things that we have attributed zero value to, like a functioning biosphere, are ultimately undergirding everything that we are now ascribing value to. So part of this is just recognizing that the environment, it's not about saving the polar bears, it's about saving us and saving the economies. Some of this is made even more clear to me. We're considering a space medicine fellowship, UCLA and a couple other people, we're working together. But that sense of you get out of the atmosphere and things get pretty bleak pretty quickly. And you don't even have to get out of the atmosphere. Some of the work we do in, the Everest area and other places, the fact that you just have to go up, 20,000 feet and you can get into a completely unsurvivable circumstance. We exist in this thinnest of little rinds on the surface of the earth. And if we want to, go into space, go to the moon, go to Mars, that everything we're taking to exist there is derived from that functioning biosphere. So I think just resetting, this isn't about money, it's about not dying, is something that we as a species kind of need to get to the point of. Wilderness medicine, I think, is proven to be out in front on questions of environmental justice and advocating for it. So clearly the multiple populations that have had the least historic and current contributions to carbon dioxide release into the atmosphere are the ones who are going to be most screwed by the process of climate change. So this is a picture of flying into Kotzebue, Alaska, where we do a lot of clinical work and some research, but it's up north of the Arctic Circle. And these are people, Inuit speaking peoples who have been there for 8,000 years plus, have been doing quite well, thank you. And they're essentially having their homes melted out from under them as the permafrost becomes no longer permanently frosted and starts crumbling away. It's having significant impacts societally on infrastructure and other ways. And so part of being involved in wilderness medicine and some awareness of climate and its impact is purely a social justice problem. Again, this is something that early on, if you would have looked at the 5 years after Dr. Hansen's presentation in 1988 before the Congress, both parties appeared to get it. Both parties appeared to be moving forward. And it's not perfectly clear why, but things have very much gone sideways from there. And we've wasted a good 30 years that were absolutely critical. And ultimately, I don't see this as in any way a partisan issue. That it's become one is just bizarre to me. This is universal at the most fundamental levels. Again, the functioning biosphere is a source of all of our health, of all of our wealth, and that's not a political issue. So we kind of need to get beyond that and get to what is rational. And if you look for, well, maybe this is just some crazy political leftist idea, you can look to people whose livelihoods depend on this. So Bernard Looney, head of BP, you can read it as well as I can read it to you, but just saying the carbon budget is finite and we're running out of time fast. So he gets it and is publicly proclaiming that. the American Petroleum Institute is their job is to advocate for essentially for use of fossil fuels. And their CEO is on record saying the threat of climate change is very real and it's an existential problem. So these are people who have every reason in the world to say, well, maybe it's not that big a problem. We can keep selling oil. But the data are so overwhelmingly clear that they're coming along. Certainly, the medical data are overwhelmingly clear. Over the last couple of years, wildfires out west. My folks have a little place up near Mount Katahdin in the Maine woods. I've looked out across that lake at Katahdin 22 miles away for pretty much all of my adult existence. And this summer, large parts of it we couldn't see. And certainly we're seeing increases in asthma, in COPD flares. The impact of fine particulate matter is real, is having health impacts right now. Certainly the psychiatric burden of a changing climate is something we're becoming aware of. And climate refugees, I think, is something that is already happening. And I don't think you have to stretch things at all far to look at Syria and the preceding drought that led to population changes that has since led to multiple nations being involved there because of the civil unrest. Climate was a huge promoter of that. And if you look at just today, I had a friend who's active in very high level military circles send me a report by the US Army, and the US Army, they're completely on board. They get this and they recognize that, holy cow, we're going to be holding the bag for increasing risk to our troops, increasing civil unrest. And this is something that we need to be responding to. So it's people are getting it. Again, I don't want to get too deeply into just data, just because I think you can get lost there, and it's important. You need to know the data, but I think we need to take the step beyond the data. But the impact, an immediate impact, we're seeing just over the course of the pandemic as habits of travel and other things have changed and air pollution levels have changed. That the existence of fine particulate matter, the PM 2.5s, are having real impact on human health in real time. And again, it's socially regressive. It's those most at risk who have least amount of resources who are most at risk. So we need to be paying attention to this. And to circle back again on the Army report, again, climate change has a real impact on national security and on the stability of our basic healthcare infrastructure. So for people who were in Manhattan during Hurricane Sandy, when major medical centers suddenly didn't have lights, didn't have elevators, had to be bagging patients who had been in a first world ICU, that's pretty developing world very quickly. And so wilderness medicine, the ability to provide care under resource limited and austere conditions, it may be an ICU in a major American city again, and I think it should be our expectation that it will be. So ultimately, my vision of wilderness medicine is it's not about going out in wild places. It can be that, certainly, but it's about providing disaster care. It's about providing forward-looking, rational care across the United States, across the globe. And part of the way we do that is through policy. So in the last bit of this, I'm going to talk about some of the things we do on the policy side of things. As either young physicians to be or active physicians, I think the key role that I've seen for healthcare providers in addressing climate change is stepping into the authority that we have and to the knowledge base that we uniquely have. So healthcare providers have a unique scientific and medical expertise, and we exist in multiple different worlds that I think we sometimes don't give ourselves credit for. Something, again, I think we don't give ourselves credit for is that we're a story-driven profession. So that ability to make sense of the world and to influence people through our storytelling is something we need to be doing, not just at the bedside. Another point where we have, I think, unique capacity that, again, we should appreciate and step into is that we're ethically driven. A large part of the world is interested in making money, and whatever would stand in the way of that, they can maybe sidestep around. I was a little bit heartened. The new head of the Harvard Business School, his father was a devotee of Mahatma Gandhi's, and he was talking about the 7 deadly sins, and the 3 that he keyed on that the business community needed to be paying more attention to were the habits that if we just followed them without thinking more, we were in danger. So it was science without humanity, commerce without morality, and knowledge without character. And I think those are 3 that increasingly, as business interests are playing out in medicine, as medicine is consolidating, as we have economic drivers of individual medical care. Part of our job, and ultimately everything in medicine for me, is taken back to the bedside. So how does this affect the individual patient I'm responsible for? Yes, we need to be responsible for populations, and we need to be economically sentient and observant. But ultimately, just as a teacher should be judged, or an educational institution should be judged on how is this affecting the ability to educate the individual student. Our ability to care for each patient is pretty key. And one of the ways we do that is in that storytelling. Again, I think it's so obvious, or just such an essential part of being human that we don't give it any credit. But every day we take discrete scientific information. So it may be a troponin of 0.4. It could be an A1C of 12, which it's just a number. Who gives a damn? But our ability is to take discrete scientific information and to put it into an actionable narrative. So we want to tell our patient, this is why this matters to you. Ms. Smith, if you want to make it to your daughter's graduation, this A1C can't be 12. You need to recognize that there are real ramifications of this. And that's something, in talking to my scientific colleagues who are freaking brilliant, and they're so good at what they do, and they're producing essential data, but they don't have the capacity sometimes to put that data into a form that people are like, oh, this is why this matters to me. And that's something that doctors do very, very well. And I think it's just a matter of being able to recognize that. The other part of the storytelling that's key, and that's been kind of a surprise to me over the last 5 years, is how much policymakers want to hear from us. So our ability to say, this was my experience with this one patient or this group of patients, provides them a tool to influence policy. So it takes something from the data zone where it's like, oh, well, this is something kind of out there and scientific, to, this is a child, this is an adult, these are the real world impacts. And that's something that I think you should be aware of. The influence of the most recent pandemic has obviously been a source of just a fantastic amount of suffering and loss, anxiety and depression. But in some ways, I'm a little heartened in that we have seen that health is recognized by international governments, by major funding organizations, as something that can alter the course of our daily business in a way that nothing else that I've seen in my lifetime has. So the ability of the pandemic to overturn, whether it's transportation policy, health policy in other ways, I think anybody who's interested in climate and health should see this as a reason to, hey, this is something we can pay attention to, and that health has the ability to flip institutions that we thought were too wealthy, too well insulated, They're not going to change. It's like things can change a lot more quickly than we think they can. The role of physicians as trusted mediators, as people who work really hard, and ideally and hopefully in every patient, the actions of individual caregivers are a fiduciary. We're putting the patient's interest ahead of our own. And because of that, patients still trust us. So our ability to be listened to both by individuals in the community and by policymakers is still better than pretty much anything else out there in the world. As we advocate for just, again, rational, this isn't a political process, but it's just like, what can we do to help protect our patients' interest? It's to recognize climate change is a healthcare emergency. So this is something that's having huge impact right now. It's only going to have more impact later. And to see climate change policy as healthcare policy, and to be able to vigorously advocate for that. So rather than shrinking before the economist or the scientist, to say, no, this is having real measurable impact on our patients right now, and this is why we need to do something about it. It is something that it's an effective tool, and it helps move things forward. And again, sometimes I think we get people in the environmental community can sometimes have a ring of self-righteousness and justice in a way that's profoundly off-putting to certain populations in the US and elsewhere. So to lay it out in unemotional, this is, a rational, nonpartisan, ultimately economically very efficient way to save lives is something we need to be doing more of. And to recognize that, again, how you tell these stories and that you tell these stories, policymakers want to hear this. And it may be, your local health board, it may be on the state level, it may be national or international levels. But as a caregiver, you have a unique capacity to influence change. Part of what we've been doing is to work with different groups. We'll work with anybody who's interested in actually advancing public health and individual health. The state's attorneys general, this was a conference we gave with NYU. They do really interesting work. And so I think this last few slides is just going to be laying out some of the things we do as a means of saying, hey, these are ways we have been involved. There are 1,000 other ones that you could be involved in. But to be willing to say, it's not just about, well, if I write a paper or if I'm not doing data generation, I can't have impact. I'd say that's not the case at all. That in seeing patients and caring for patients, you have the ability to impact policy far more than you know. We've been pretty active at the Kennedy School over the last 2 or 3 years. John Holdren, who is Obama's chief science advisor for all 8 years, has been a great supporter of the impact of health, and just to recognize that health should have a voice at the table on policy that it hasn't up until now. That's been good. You got to get up north while you can. The Arctic ice is beautiful before it melts. As part of that, we're involved with a number of different trans-Arctic groups. One where we've got a fellow with Luca Pisa's up there right now. So again, this is north of the Arctic Circle up on the Chukchi Sea, but trying to provide both medical care, medical support, looking at some research opportunities is something that I think is important. And if anybody's interested in, I'm happy to talk more. We haven't had medical students up there so far, but it's something we're considering. And residents, we've had fellows up there. But why it's important on the global scale is that the permafrost covering the northern part of the world has roughly twice as much carbon in it as is currently extant in the atmosphere. So this has been locked away over tens of thousands of years. And as things warm up, it's melting and it's being gobbled up by microbes and released back in the atmosphere. And this is largely not built into the climate models. So we've gone from 280 parts per million to 415 plus or minus parts per million of carbon dioxide in the environment, in the atmosphere. And if we've got, not 100, 120, 130 parts per million increase, but if we could be doubling that, it could be just fantastic, the impact it has. And it's so part of our work is working with different groups to try to support the scientists, better understand, what are the ramifications of this and how quickly is it changing? I was just thinking John Holden sent me an email late last night looking at it. Turns out the Greenland's glaciers are belching up a lot more methane than anybody had any idea. So these are things that there's just a whole new world out there that, we act like, oh, well, it's up there, it's up north, we don't have to worry about it. But as long as you're anywhere within 100 vertical feet of a coast, these are things you want to be thinking seriously about. SciMed, I mentioned only because I think it's something that could be replicated widely, but it's a program we've developed with our colleagues in Kotzebue to try to impact kind of the complexity of this. So it's not just medicine, it's not just the environment, it's not just health equity and environmental justice, but trying to put them all together is, if anybody's interested, I'm happy to chat more. It's a good, I didn't include it. I just got a email from Luke, who's in Kotzebue right now, but the Northern Lights are quite fantastic the last week or so. So it's another reason to go up and do good work. Part of the work we were doing, again, is in supporting scientists. So working with the Woods Hole Research Center, now the Woodwell Climate Research Center, in different places in Alaska and Chertsky, Siberia. There, obviously, you look at Canada is pretty big and Alaska is pretty big. And then you look at Russia and just, it is so vast. And the vast majority of that northern third is permafrost. So there are a lot of interesting places in the world to go and to help better figure out where things are going. So the Colima River is the source of some of our mercury work and looking at using mercury as a marker for distant environmental or contamination from distant industrial sources of the environment. So there's some interesting work to be done out there. And this is a place where, as the permafrost is melting, you got chunks of ancient life that are just being revealed. So you can walk along the banks of the Colima River, and that's a mastodon femur that you can find vertebra, you can find tusks that are from the ground that's 10 to 40,000 plus years old. And if you look at this, it's been so kind of impeccably frozen and cared for over this period of time. You can see individual little fibrinous roots that were a summer's growth 30,000 years ago, and they're still there. So there's some pretty remarkably beautiful things that are being revealed as this world is being mobilized again. Finishing up on Aldo Leopold, I'll put it out here. I usually tell people this, I'm not a rich man, but I'm happy to buy anybody a book. That his Sand County Almanac is one of our standard readings. And I can have you read this, but his sense, he wrote this in immediately post World War II. He died fighting a neighbor's forest fire in '48. But he was one of the earliest scientists to recognize, he was an ecologist, wildlands, and recognized that the impact of the environment on individuals was much vaster than anybody credited at the time. And his statement, they're saying an ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Has rung true to me for a long period of time. And I think as physicians who see that health is an ecological phenomena, so this nutty ass idea that, health occurs within concrete walls, that it's a hospital-based phenomena is just nuts. in that we need to recognize that the sole source of our health is that functioning environment. And yes, sometimes we can do good work inside a hospital, but if you have a choice between a functioning biosphere and concrete walls, choose the functioning biosphere. And so the next steps are, I think, are working towards that ethic, working towards just a way of looking at the world that recognizes physical realities. And part of that is taking care of yourselves, taking care of your colleagues, and ultimately taking care of your patients. And so the diagnostic capacity of story is vast. The therapeutic capacity of story is something I don't think we do a very good job of paying attention to. So down in the bottom right corner, that's a picture of the guy in the beard, is Anton Chekhov, largely credited as the inventor of the modern short story, was a Russian physician and writer. And he, in a time when there were no certainly established roads, and there certainly wasn't a Siberian Trans-Siberian Railway, was deeply interested in the plight of the penal colonies of Sakhalin Island, and pretty much traveled across the vast expanse. You remember 7 time zones just to get where we were in Chertsky. He was another time zone beyond that, as an act of social justice and awareness. But that sense of storytelling to heal and to give purpose is something that I think we need to pay more attention to. For us as scientists, as physicians, to believe in the consequences of science. We can tell kind of all kinds of different stories, but if they're not girded in a basic appreciation for the way the world in fact works and the way biology is in fact structured, then it's not going to probably end well. And so as we move forward into the world, that intersection of humanity and the biosphere and the science, that's yours. As a physician, that is nothing that you should ever let anybody push you off of. So to have an economist, a politician, somebody in business to say, no, you don't understand. I say, bullshit. You understand vastly more than they do. And that's something, that's your lane. You should own it. And you should be willing to step forward into the world saying, I'm acting in a fiduciary, I'm acting in my patient's interest. And ultimately, it's our own self-interest as humans. Again, we're not saving polar bears, we're saving ourselves. The last slide is just talking about, and sometimes people say, this is so hopeless, it's so baked in and inevitable, and we're not going to be able to do anything. And I don't see it that way at all. I think for those of you who've been involved clinically in the last 2 years, just the degree of suffering and of loss and of separation from families, it's been crushing. It's been awful. But at the same time, just the ability of we as caregivers of patients, of our populations, to step forward with hope. It's just something, it's not a rational process. It's baked into our DNA. It's baked into our existences. And so I'm overall, I think we got some hard decisions ahead and we need to make some real changes. But recognizing that while we may be the first generation in history to recognize, holy crap, we as human beings are having a profound impact on the planet, that we're also in a unique place that we can have agency. We can change this and we will change this. And as I look forward, that's really my concern. It is, I think about my patients with alcohol use disorder, and if you can, get them, or opiate use disorder, get them when they're in a bad place and help them to see, this is something we can move forward on, that people can be responsive, where if you wait until you have an anoxic brain injury or you need your liver replaced, you're at the same place that you were before, but you're much less likely to be able to capitalize on it. So overall, I think there are all kinds of great reasons to be hopeful and to think things are going to change. And a huge part of that process is each of you stepping up and recognize, and this is your lane. This is something you have unique powers to influence and to run with that. With that, I'll stop talking and I'll happily respond to chats. I don't seem to have access to them, but
I can see some of them. You do have
Yep.
one question here from Ella Stanley. Where do you see the responsibility of physicians in terms of making dietary suggestions that are also more sustainable for health, climate change?
oh, you ought to be sitting at my dinner table tonight. Ella, it's a great question, and there are ways that having if you're going to argue that it's a global system that you're looking at, how we generate our proteins and our foods, and its impact on health is pretty vast. I think it can be culturally a little difficult, but I think I've got tons of colleagues and friends who are working on that. And I think to have a more plant-based diet is probably purely for individual health interest, and then for a global interest, it looks like, it's hard to argue otherwise with a straight face. That being said, I think sometimes we can get a little strident in that and recognize that in some ways things are going to change in the future for sure, and they're already changing. There's just a study out looking at the differences between kind of dairy-based fats and olive oil-based fats. And I thought what was interesting to me wasn't so much that, hey, it looks like plant-based fats are probably better for us. I think we've got good data on that. But just how in the course of the study, how quickly dietary preferences were changing in that population. So I think it's an area that things are changing quickly, and they'll probably continue to. Nat,
All right, I also,
Yeah.
sorry. I have another question from Katrina, which is, what are things students can do now to take action?
I think one, take care of yourself, take care of your colleagues, take care of your patients. I think sometimes we get much too overwrought with kind of the self-righteous justice, I'm going to change the world aspect of it. And you can't change anything if you're not taking care of things at home where you are, where your patients are. I think as you do that, and as you go through medical training, I think this group is extraordinary. And just as I've become more familiar with them, the ability to reach out again to policymakers, and they can be, local health, they can be anywhere in the government system. I've been blown away how just in my interactions with across the board and across the nation, people are well-meaning and they're working hard. And this sense of, oh, you're a government worker, you're just there sitting around taking up space. These have been people with just extraordinary intellects, capacities, and practicalities, just looking at how can we make things better for our populations. So I think investigating that is something that's certainly useful. I think being well-read and being comfortable with, whether it's Aldo Leopold or others, to have some familiarity with kind of the deeper thinking that's gone on before us. There's been and I'm happy I've got a book list that I have that we use on Medicine in the Wild. I'm happy to share with people. But just to give yourselves, you don't, expect to be taken seriously as an orchestra conductor if you don't have some basic grounding in music theory and who's done what in the past. If you don't know who Beethoven is, they're probably not going to pay attention to you, and probably with good reason. But so trying to get some familiarity with some of the thinking that's gone on as far as the intersection of humans and the environment, I think is something that medicine is kind of lacking on, and I've been trying to address.
Awesome. I have one more question. It's a little long, but essentially, Nat is saying that in Montana, there are a range of issues affecting human health through an ecological lens, including forest fires, public land conservation, mining, and rivers. And they can foresee an ecological medicine committee in our state medical association to focus on these issues. Has this been done elsewhere in the United States? that you know
Wow,
of.
Matt, excellent question. Not that I'm aware of. And that's something that I think in Montana is critically important, in New Jersey and Massachusetts. It's so fundamentally important. And I don't know, I'm trying to address the human health through an ecological lens, in that I think sometimes we don't step back and see the whole $100 trillion as this ought to be viewed through an ecological lens, because that's where it has its origins. So no, whether it's starting in Montana or wherever else you want to, I think that's exciting as hell. I think it's part of just expanding kind of, oh, holy crap, I hadn't thought about it like that. That it's not just physicians, that it's citizens and policymakers, and to try to, your question strikes me as quite generous and open and willing to talk about things. And I think that's where we're trying to thread the line right now, and to see how some of the conversations surrounding the pandemic and vaccination and other things have gone. It's just like they've been so mismanaged on so many different levels, that to try to get to a forum where we can have a respectful conversation on topics that are right now politically charged, that don't need to be, that shouldn't be. My hat's off to you, and let me know if there's any way I can help you.
And that is the last question that we have. I want to thank you as well as on the behalf of Shilpi. She's very upset that she couldn't make it here, but she says you're the best, and I think we all agree. Thank you so much for coming by today. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks on the 23rd for our next lecture.
Beautiful. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. Keep up the good work. Best of luck.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye, Owen.
Bye, Dr. Harris. Thank you.